Tēnā koutou katoa. No Ireland aho, ara no Dublin, ko sugarloaf te maunga, ko liffey te awa, ko kels te iwi. Ko Jerry toka papa, ko Ann toka mama, ko Daniel ko Rebecca aku tamariki, ko Debbie toka inua, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Hello everybody, and I'd just like to give a big shout out to Lily and thank her for inviting me along. Lily from the Edmund Hillary Fellowship. I know all you Kiwis know that name really well, but as an Irish person, we just are in awe of what the fellowship achieves. So I'm really, really pleased to be here today at the Tolaga Bay Inn. And I understand it's an old building, which is now an innovation space, which is awesome because that's a very circular approach. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about an area that I'm really passionate about, which is the circular economy. So I went back to university a few years ago because of my passion for the environment and sustainability. And people often say to me, why didn't you do an environmental science degree? And my view is it's not an environmental science problem. This is a human behavior and business problem. So I went back and I did an MBA. So the circular economy was the focus of my MBA thesis. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of the general principles and then just some areas that might be of interest to the work that you guys are trying to do. I'm trying to find in New Zealand where the energy is in the circular economy space and support those groups to go faster, perhaps to connect it to other things that they may not have considered. So hopefully you'll get something out of the session today. I wish I could be there in person, but I'm actually visiting my family in Ireland at the time that this hui is taking place. So I wish you guys all the best and happy for a follow-up conversation later when I'm back on deck in Aotearoa. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the circular economy, one of the easiest ways to explain it is to compare it with the economy we've got now, which is linear. So the linear economy has been around for a long time. It's very comfortable with a cradle to grave approach. Waste to landfill is, hardwired into its design or lack of design, if you like. And we're very comfortable with single use. And that is changing to a degree, but largely in relation to things like, straws and coffee cups. But in fact, we've got to the point where things like fridges and dishwashers are single use. And then 6 years later, they're ending up in landfill and then it's a big drama. And that is really not where we need to be. It is also very, very siloed in its thinking. So the economy is pretty much optimizing the financial capital. It's about GDP, it's about dollars. And that's driven by a very short-term mindset. Very much about efficiency. So we have very short cycles. Our election cycles are short, share price reporting, annual reports, all of those mechanisms that we would need to support long-term thinking are not hardwired into our economic system. I'm not going to go into any great detail about the fossil fuel issue. We're all very well aware of how that drives externalities and climate change and all of that terrible stuff. But the revenue model itself is also part of the problem. If you're a successful company and you want to be more successful, then it usually means throughput, pushing more material through the system. And then you clip the ticket every time you get a sale. So that really encourages bad behavior and this drive towards consumption. A circular economy, on the other hand, is trying to flip that model on its head. We're trying to get more to a cradle-to-cradle approach. Imagine a city that has no landfill. Every component of that city would have to be redesigned. We would have to, there is no over there, there is no, over the wall that you can throw it into. You have got to find a way to circulate materials, change the business models of a city so that is not the outcome. So we're trying to design out waste. Currently, we're designing a lot with waste. So we're not really grappling with the challenges of, if a bath is overflowing, the first thing you do is turn off the water. So we're leaving till it becomes a problem and not actually designing for the cycling of that material repetitively. So we're not considering its second and third cycle when we start at the beginning. And that leads us into some of the challenges we've got now trying to find off-takes or opportunities to recirculate these materials, but we're not designing that way in the first place. So a circular economy is also looking beyond silos. It's looking at things like the SDGs and integrated reporting, 6 capitals. And even the financial sector is they're driving the integrated reporting approach because they can see the total fundamentally undermining of their economic system if you're not balancing those capitals. So we cannot continue this siloed GDP obsession, which often does not deliver value. to a broad sector of communities. A lot of that value is captured by where the existing wealth ownership is concentrated. So circular economy is very much looking at resilience rather than efficiency. How do you design resilience into the system so that it can cope with shocks? It can cope with, fires and floods, and optimize yield for every year, which then makes the system brittle. And I think that's one of the key lessons we've learned from COVID, is that long, complex supply chains are very brittle. And that has exposed us to things that we probably never had considered before. One of the stories that scares me was one of the cities in Australia, I can't remember which one, were like 6 weeks away from running out of the water filter components for their water system. So that is a catastrophic outcome. And so there's certain things that you should probably make in your own country, regardless of the cost. It's so critically important to the functioning of your society that we need to be closing the loops and tightening the geographic areas where some of these things should be manufactured. And that's where the term, I'd never heard it before COVID, of sovereign manufacturing is gaining a lot of traction. And a circular economy lends itself very well to that narrative. The revenue model itself in a circular economy is more about value and performance rather than consumption and throughput. So that flips the types of business models that you might see in a circular economy. But you would also see a clear idea of what the second and third and the future iterations of those products might be. So key 3 principles of the circular economy is to regenerate natural systems, keep materials and products in use at their highest value. And that's a really important point. And I'll talk a little bit about that in one of the slides later. And the other one is designing out waste and pollution. So I've talked a little bit about what those are. So there's been a period of a journey to refine these. A few years ago, it was 5 or 6 of them, but they've been, combined into these 3, and they're probably broadly accepted globally that these are the 3 key principles of a circular economy. I also wanted to just make the point around where that fits on the sustainability maturity spectrum. So this is probably a pretty well-known sustainability maturity matrix. Most businesses are probably somewhere in the middle. But sustainability is really only useful if you're happy with the status quo and you want to sustain it. If you really want to get to those much better outcomes and regenerate the systems that in some ways we've almost broken, then we need to be getting far beyond sustainability. I'm not going to go into this slide in any great detail. The purpose of it is to show the momentum behind the transition to a circular economy. So whether it's regional, sector, national, international, this is a significant global paradigm shift. And think of it, if you will, of the coding of the economy has been linear for hundreds of years. Now we're rewriting that code to be circular. So there's no element of society or the economy that is not going to be affected by this. And there's a big movement in that city space, circular cities. There's lots of great resources out there around what would a circular city look like. So lots of places have the transition well underway. They'll have roadmaps, action plans, frameworks, a whole variety. So it's really just to show that there's significant momentum behind this shift. Here in New Zealand, we're starting to see the context and policy change. So some of the big pieces that have changed recently are around the ERP, the National Emissions Reduction Plan. And that's basically setting out the budgets, the carbon budgets for New Zealand for the next few years. And what's key to note in those is there's a really strong narrative around shifting to a circular economy. And I've got a slide with a little bit more detail. And then this whole notion of empowering Māori. It also comes through strongly in the Infrastructure Commission strategy to 2052. The circular economy is one of its 5 key focus areas, and including strengthening partnerships with Māori. So we can see this transition underway. We're starting to see what that potentially needs to look like. So New Zealand's a little bit late to the party, if you will, but it's really starting to land now at a policy space. And now it's up to the rest of us to kind of engage in those conversations and step into sculpting how we would like that to work for our communities and for our region. And it's really important to me that, the circular economy and Te Māori conversations are kept really tightly connected in New Zealand. Indigenous communities have been thinking this way in systems and regeneratively in loops and circles for millennia, and we can learn a lot from listening and engaging in a much more productive conversation. There is has been some work done in New Zealand over the last few years. We had the world's first Pacific Indigenous Circular Economy Summit in Rotorua a few years ago, which was hosted and supported by the Ministry for the Environment. The Amiomio Aotearoa is driven out of the University of Waikato. And then we have this piece that was co-designed with Taina Bosa, I think it was, from Rotorua, with Juhi Sharif, where what does it look like for a circular economy and a Te Māori worldview to connect. So just really, really exciting things happening in that space. So I've uplifted some of the key points out of the ERP, the National Emissions Reduction Plan. There's a whole chapter on the circular economy. And actually, when I did a search, a Control F search in the document, there's 106 mentions in the document of the ERP. And that's more than, showed up for just transition or decarbonizing. So there's clearly a sense of momentum behind it in this space, which is really, really good. And so lots and lots of still, kind of broad stroke narrative. There's I think there's still work to be done to unpack this in more detail, and it would be great to be part of some of these conversations, supporting businesses, communities, the public sector to shift into a more circular and thriving bioeconomy. And this notion of circular emissions, keen to unpack what that might look like. Like, as I said, if you're completely reimagining the future in a circular way, well, then there's lots of circular emissions out there for consideration. And I wanted to talk a little bit about circular precincts because, we're starting to think beyond the borders or the boundaries of an organization. And if you really, really want to benefit from something called industrial symbiosis, which is, how do you create a precinct whereby you can share the waste, material, and energy flows of different businesses? And that image at the top right corner is what are called in Australia special activation precincts. So they're looking at if you're going to set up a new factory or a new material recovery facility, or even just a new economic development area, and you want to attract certain businesses into that, a circular economy opportunity would present itself if there was consideration of how that waste energy, heat, and materials could flow between those buildings or those organizations. So this is a framework that they're driving out through the Department of Planning, Innovation and Enterprise, I think it is, in New South Wales. But you can clearly see that the circular economy thinking is at the heart of how those precincts would operate. And the city of Greater Bendigo put out I think it was an organics or a food waste and organics tender into the market a few years ago, and clearly premised on the notion of a circular approach. So looking for opportunities to take the intakes of waste, process them, and the offtakes, and the co-location of the businesses who might do both. So the circular economy precinct conversation is a really big shift, in not so big a shift in in Europe, but certainly we're starting to see it land here. They've been doing that for quite a while. And this example in the screen, I think it's called NAFA Innovation Park. That was actually a case study in the ERP. So we're starting to see some movement in that direction in New Zealand, which is really, really good. And I wanted to show this example because if you remember the first slide, I talked about cycling material at its highest possible value. And this is just one example of a project that was that we had been looking at in Lake Mac, where I worked as a council in Australia. So if you look at the default setting, often for organics waste is composting, and composting can be a pretty low value activity. And what they were finding in certain markets was they just couldn't find the offtakes for it. So even though they were trying to do the right thing and creating compost, there wasn't a huge demand. And on the other hand, we had the poultry sector who were having massive increase in costs for the inputs for their poultry feeds. And so how do we connect a problem in one part of the system to a potential solution that a circular economy lens across that might provide? So this is just an example. There could be lots of other things you could do with different types of waste. So if we keep to that, what is a better value? What is a higher value? It kind of steers our thinking in a different direction. And I also wanted to make the point that there's a lot going on. There's a lot of drivers. There's a lot of pressures. We're hearing, particularly on communities and councils, to, you know, be resilient and getting ready for adaptation to climate change. We've got net zero targets. We've got, you know, wanting to do better in this sustainable development goals and this notion of just transition. And, you know, my view is that if you have a really well articulated circular economy approach or strategy or framework, that can still support you to deliver on all of those other things that are important to you, without having to do lots and lots of different things. So it's really just an organizing approach to how you might want to do your work, and it gives you some good, strong steers, and there's a huge amount of resources available, because one of the advantages to being behind is you have a leapfrog approach. A lot of the testing has been done, a lot of resources have been developed that are there, and the vast majority of them are open access. So that's kind of it from me. So I just wanted to, that was just, I know that's a whistle stop tour and there's a lot of information in there, but just really wanted to set up a narrative and, you know, spark some ideas for what might be discussed for the rest of the day. But really it's thinking in the longer term, thinking in systems. And, you know, this quote on the screen is a direct uplift from the ERP, where we're expected to do more. Both the private sector and local governments need to do more in this shift and this transition to a circular economy. And I think if we're proactive and lean into those spaces, we have more of an opportunity to shape how that might look, rather than waiting for potentially the pace that might not suit where we feel we need to be at, but also a sense of how do we get our values and what's important to us incorporated into how that work might unfold. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come along today and talk to you. I hope that's useful, and more than happy for anyone to reach out to me when I'm back from my trip to see my family. Thank you.
Kia ora.